Have you ever heard of somebody truly believing that they are dead, decaying, losing their internal organs? It sounds like the plot of a horror movie, right? But for some people, this terrifying delusion is a harsh reality. This rare condition is known as Cotard syndrome, or more hauntingly, walking corpse syndrome. First described by French neurologist Jules Cotard in the 19th century, this disorder makes people feel like they are living corpses. They might believe they have no blood, no organs, or even that they are entirely dead. They can often understand that their bodies are still on earth, that they are walking and talking, but despite this, they know themselves to be entirely dead. It does sound like a purely psychological phenomenon, but what if I told you experts nowadays think it might not be? What if the brain is genuinely dead? In today's episode, we're going to explore the bizarre and fascinating world of Cotard syndrome. We'll discuss its symptoms, causes, and some truly incredible real-life cases. And we'll also take a look at how modern medicine understands and treats this mind-boggling condition. But we'll dive into the tale of walking corpse syndrome in just a moment. First, I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor today, Midas Merge. I rely so much on sponsors to keep this channel going, so any support you can show me and my sponsor will be incredible. Midas Merge is a mobile game in which you'll discover and nurture the most amazing creatures and gardens. The game revolves around this addictive fun of merging. You combine various cute creatures, uncover unique evolutions and abilities, and that's what helps keep the game so engaging. And guess what? It's completely free with no mandatory ads, and you can even play offline anywhere you want. But let's talk about the lore, because Midas Merge isn't just about merging. It's an immersive narrative journey where you join King Midas and Queen Lyra on a quest to restore the Gardens of Gold. Along the way, you'll hatch new creatures and feed them magical items to create sunbursts, illuminating the land overshadowed by Nyx, the goddess of night. This game's story, it runs deep. You'll use the Vault of Riches to find treasures, amazing decorations, and advancements for your garden. Plus, the dynamics between Nyx, Lyra, and King Midas are much more complex than they might seem. As you play, you'll uncover clues and piece together the mystery behind Nyx's decision to cast shadows over the Gardens of Gold. With Midas Merge, I can play for 2 minutes or 2 hours straight. The gardens are gorgeous and I love to merge my creatures to evolve them to higher levels. My personal favourite is the capybird. It started as this really cute little baby flying capybara and then merged into this beautiful level 3 creature. I can't wait to merge it again and see what's next. So, if you're looking for a game that combines the fun of merging with an epic story and beautiful gardens, Midas Merge is definitely the one for you. Download it right now and start your journey with King Midas and Queen Lyra. And Midas Merge, you're actually giving away a $500 Amazon voucher to one of you lucky people who downloads the game and reaches level 10. So make sure you download and get playing to get entered to win this amazing prize. $500. $500. You might as well. You can download it through the QR code that's been on screen this entire time, or you can find the link in the top line of my description. So, walking corpse syndrome, Cotard syndrome. Let's start at the very beginning by talking about the man after whom it is named, neurologist and psychiatrist Jules Cotard. He was born on June 1st, 1840 in Issoudun in France. I'm just going to apologise here for my terrible French pronunciation throughout this episode. I was notoriously bad at French in school to the point where they actually advised me not to continue it. Like, I got banned from French class because I was so bad. As a young man, he moved to Paris where he became a medical student and studied under some of the biggest French physicians of this time, particularly some trailblazing neurologists, people studying the brain. Cotard decided this was the area that he was going to specialise in as well. It was a mystery to doctors back then and still is even today. Everyone wanted to be the one to find the answers, to be the first person to truly understand the human brain. And Cotard was specifically interested in the gamut of nervous diseases and madness in its multiple forms. As the years went by, he became quite a big name in the world of neurology. He joined the army as a surgeon in the Franco-Prussian War, then he returned to Paris, where he worked with the psychiatrically ill and sick poor from all over Paris, always focusing on psychiatry. And then in 1874, he moved to Vanves, a suburb of Paris, where he worked for the rest of his life. He got married, he had 3 kids, and focused on his studies, now in diabetes. He taught the Medical Association of France about diabetic hypoglycemia and how altered mental states could be caused by diabetes. He realised for most people just how careful you had to be when dealing with people with altered mental states, how closely you had to observe them, and how mental states can have an effect on physical symptoms. And this was pretty incredible for a time in which people with even the slightest psychiatric complaint would be locked up in an asylum. I mean, where Cotard worked in Vanves was an asylum, but he genuinely tried to understand the human brain. He tried to understand what was going on. And it seems like he saw these people, whereas a lot of other doctors just didn't. Throughout his career, Cotard's name became synonymous with psychiatry. He wrote about psychotic delusions, hypomania, bipolar, and anxiety depression. So much of the understanding we have today of psychiatric conditions comes from Cotard. He wrote at length about delusions of grandeur, of how the brain in psychotic patients acts to make some people feel superhuman. And then in June 1880, he delivered a lecture at the Société Médico-Psychologique in Paris, talking of what he at the time called délire de négations, which we know today as Cotard syndrome or walking corpse syndrome. This unshakable belief in which somebody believes that they are dead or they have lost their blood, internal organs, or soul. But how did Cotard discover this phenomenon? Well, one afternoon in the mid-1870s, a seemingly healthy 43-year-old woman walked into his office. She told him that she was anxious and depressed and that she was experiencing something very, very odd. She said that she felt as though a lightning bolt had hit her, this electrical feeling suddenly coming out of nowhere and shooting up her spine, crackling all the way up to her brain. And ever since that moment, she has believed herself to be completely and utterly dead, despite the fact that she is aware that she is walking and talking. She exists, but she knows that she is dead. She complained that she didn't have a brain, nerves, chest, stomach, or guts. All that she had left was the skin and bones of her disorganised body. This woman had been ill in the hospital for about 2.5 years and said that she felt like a lost soul. She'd sought the help of priests and doctors on multiple occasions, and she'd also tried to end her own life multiple times. And Cotard was absolutely fascinating. Instead of dismissing her claims, which many other people have done, he studied her closely, and she would later become known in his papers as Madame X. Cotard found out that Madame X had had a spiritual crisis at one point. She believed that she was damned and that she personally was to blame for all kinds of sins. She believed that she was being punished by God for all of her wrongdoings in the past. And then one day she just realised that she was dead. The lightning bolt that hit her was a religious epiphany of sorts, or at least that's how she understood what was happening to her. When you wake up one day and realise that you're dead, even if you're not, you're going to try and make your own sense of what's happening, and religious people are more likely to turn to those religious beliefs. But what happens when one believes that they are dead? How does that affect their life? Well, Madame X believed that she no longer had reason to eat, and she also believed that she would no longer be able to die from natural causes. She thought the only way she'd be able to die was by being burnt alive, and she constantly asked other people to set fire to her. And when that failed, she set fire to herself on multiple occasions. And it didn't mean anything because she already thought she was dead, just her body still lived. Her belief in all of this was absolutely unshakable. She was dead and that was that. But she also knew that her body was alive and she needed to set fire to it to kill it. But her brain was dead. Does it make sense? Probably not. It's a psychological disorder. Of course it doesn't make sense. Cotard also described how Madame X was unbalanced and violent, with her calling her acts of violence acts of truth. Madame X and Cotard would work together for a really long time, and after a few months, as he said in his lecture, she started to improve from her anxious melancholia. She was calmer, but in her daily interactions, she became malicious and sardonic. Her delusions, however, did not change. She continued to complain that she didn't have any brain, nerves, or guts. She continued to believe that eating was a useless torture and that death by fire was the only solution to her condition. Now, it would be easy to believe that all of this was purely psychological, but a baffling point that Cotard simply couldn't explain away was that Madame X also didn't seem to be able to feel pain anymore. He would prick her with a pin and she would show zero reaction. However, she could feel just general touch. In the early days of his time with Madame X, Cotard described her condition as some sort of reverse grandiosity or maybe paranoia, but nothing quite fit the symptoms that she was experiencing. And so he turned to books, realising that she wasn't the first person in history to report this kind of feeling. In his lecture in 1880, Cotard spoke about 5 cases which were similar. A woman who believed that the devil had inhabited her body and that she could never die, and another similar one who thought the devil had taken her body away and she was simply a vision. Numbers 3 and 4 had similar feelings around the devil, and number 5 simply thought she didn't have a heart and therefore couldn't die. The fact that 4 of these included the devil, that Madame X believed that she was being punished by God, could suggest some sort of religious element here, but I'm kind of unsure. I think this is just a product of the time in which these cases were happening. A heavily religious society means that when weird things happen, you just automatically blame it on religion. It's something to do with God or the devil. It's unexplainable. It's religion. I wouldn't necessarily call this a religious delusion, just a delusion of the time in which it's happening, if that makes sense. The psychology here was just fascinating. These people were seriously unhappy about the fact they were dead, but no matter how much you tried to prove that they weren't, they just wouldn't believe it. They would come down with serious anxious melancholia and anxiety which continued to worsen with time. I mean, just imagine being convinced that you're dead. I'm sure you would be very anxious about the whole thing. In 1882, Cotard published a paper in the French Neurology Archives and entitled it Du délire des négations, still working very closely with Madame X. He was very determined that he was going to cure her, but nothing seemed to work. But this phenomenon would become his life's work, his legacy. He was never able to find answers in his lifetime, but he did provide the building blocks. He differentiated between just a severe depression and this genuine syndrome. Again, it was thought to be psychological, entirely in someone's head. But then why could Madame X not feel pain? Like, surely there was something more going on. And this was a time before brain scans, before modern technology. There was only so much Cotard could do. Unless he literally killed Madame X and took her brain out, he couldn't see anything. So was this just delusion, or was it something more? Sadly, Cotard would never find out the answer. This was his life's work. But in August 1889, his daughter contracted diphtheria and he was distraught. He sat by her bedside, nursing her back to health for 15 days straight. And there's no record saying whether or not the daughter survived, but we do know that Cotard ended up contracting it himself. And diphtheria is not something you want, and luckily nowadays it is rarer thanks to vaccines, but it's a serious bacterial infection affecting the mucous membranes of the nose and throat. It causes this build-up of grey tissue in the throat, which eventually means you can't swallow or breathe, and you suffocate to death. Yeah, you really don't want diphtheria. Cotard probably knew that catching it was a risk of caring for his daughter so closely, but he did it anyway, and then over 5 days got increasingly ill himself. He developed an acute respiratory obstruction, and the doctors did attempt to do an emergency tracheostomy, which was just said to prolong his suffering. He died on August 19th, 1889. But what a legacy to leave behind, leaving the world with more knowledge than before you were born, allowing a bit more kindness, I suppose, in dealing with people with severe mental disorders. When Cotard was alive, his disorder was always referred to as délire des négations, but in 1893, another doctor coined it as Cotard syndrome, as people in the field continued to research to find answers to his unanswered questions. But the main question was this syndrome just a particularly severe form of melancholia or depression as we call it today, or was it its own thing entirely? And that's kind of a question that's still outstanding to this very day. The problem is that it's so hard to research a phenomenon that's so incredibly rare. According to WebMD today, there are only about 200 cases known worldwide, and I cannot stress enough just how rare that is. Like 200 people. There are 7 billion people living on this planet, and only 200 of them suffer from this. That is so rare. But let me tell you about another example of Cotard's, a modern example, because this is undeniably fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. I found a paper on the National Library of Medicine, I'll link it down below, that details the case of a Mr. B, a 65-year-old retired teacher with no family history of mental illness. And then one day, he started suffering with depression, a low mood, not wanting to socialise, decreased sleep and appetite, and this slowly snowballed into feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness and guilt. He felt like his life was coming to an end, saying that his brain and organs had stopped functioning, despite the fact that they clearly were because he was alive. He just didn't feel like it. And then one day he attempted to end his own life. This is a fascinating thing you'll see again and again in people suffering with Cotard's. They'll verbalise that they believe they're dead, and the evidence shows that they 100% believe what they're saying, they do believe they're dead, or at least they kind of believe that their organs and brain are no longer working, suggesting that they are dead, but they will still attempt to end their own lives. So part of them must believe that they are not dead, that they are still alive. It's just fascinating. It's noted in the paper that Mr. B lacked complete insight into his illness. An MRI brain scan didn't reveal any abnormalities, and he was treated with ECT, electroconvulsive treatments. And this seems very old school, like something used in asylums of old, but it is still a treatment that does have its place today. It basically causes a brief surge of electrical activity within your brain, or basically a seizure, and it is said that it can greatly and rapidly improve severe symptoms of depression, mania, or catatonia. From my research, it does seem like nowadays it is done under anaesthesia, and it should only be offered as a treatment if you've tried everything else to no avail. Some doctors completely disagree with ECT, and it seems like research into whether it actually helps or not is quite iffy. Some people say it really does, others say it doesn't. We don't really know, but they clearly do still use it sometimes. But for Mr. B, ECT with a cocktail of medications seemed to actually help. It's written that his symptoms resolved completely over a period of about 7 weeks, and he was eventually discharged. The human brain is just wild. Like, how can you go from fully believing that you're dead, repeatedly trying to end your own life, to a healthy discharge just a couple of months later? Like, that is wild. When we're talking about symptoms of Cotard's today, we're still talking about this belief that you are dead, but there is a lot that sort of comes alongside that, and of course it is wildly different from person to person. In some, you'll find a complete neglect of self-care, with sufferers not only refusing to eat, but refusing to wash or sleep because dead people don't need to. They may deny their own existences, believing they have no consciousness, but at the same time, they also believe themselves to be immortal. Like, the dichotomy there is fascinating. There's also a general emotional apathy. They're just emotionally numb, they're not reactive to anything at all, and they become increasingly less social as time goes by. But some people are found to be completely self-aware, like they believe themselves to be dead, they believe their brains or organs have died, they believe that they don't have consciousness, but when it's pointed out to them that they must be alive because they're walking and talking, they will agree and understand. Yes, like logically I know I'm alive, but physically I feel dead is kind of how they put it. However, for others, they can't put those two things together. No matter how much you try to explain, they can't corroborate those two details. The causes section on the WebMD Cotard's page states that we don't know what causes this syndrome, but we do know that it's often, not always, but often, a symptom of a deeper medical problem affecting the brain, such as dementia, epilepsy, migraines, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, stroke, or subdural bleeding. Some experts think it's caused by 2 types of brain damage, the first changing the way that people view themselves, and the second making them continue to believe this false idea. But there's no answers for sure, like nobody knows, it's all speculation and theories. Historically, it seems that most people get struck with this around their early 50s. They might also have a history of mental health problems, but the issue is here that the pool of people to assess is so small. When so few people suffer, are you able to say for sure what sufferers may have in common? At what point is it coincidence, and at what point can you say, that's a pattern? In sufferers nowadays, we can do scans and tests and brain imaging, and apparently brain damage does quite often show up. So you're looking at strokes, tumours, blood clots, or just some kind of injury, which I don't think is a surprise, but then again, it's not always. Like, people with Cotards don't always have brain damage. But something experts are pretty sure of today is that Cotard syndrome is not a standalone disease. It usually comes hand in hand with some other condition. It's not listed in the DSM, and that does make it hard to diagnose because there's no list for doctors to follow when making diagnoses. However, it is recognised as a disease of human health in the International Classification of Diseases and is often linked with psychosis, clinical depression and schizophrenia. But thanks to studies that are done, today there are believed to be sort of like 3 stages of the syndrome: the germination, blooming and chronic phases. The germination phase refers to the beginning stages, a patient slowly falling into a severe state of anxiety and depression. They just go completely inwards, leading to the blooming stage, where they believe they don't exist inside their bodies. And I might be about to completely expose myself here, so I hope other people can actually relate to this. But we all know, I'm sure, that feeling occasionally where you just feel like you don't exist inside your body. Like, everything feels like a bubble, the mental health is not mental healthing, and your body just doesn't feel like it belongs to you. At least as somebody who suffered with severe anxiety for her entire life, I know that I personally can relate to this. Maybe you could describe it as sort of a state of depersonalization. But in the blooming stage, it goes even that one step further, because you really begin to feel like parts of your body no longer exist. Your lungs, your brain, your heart, you feel like they've gone. You might even start to entirely deny that you exist. I've never quite reached that stage, but sometimes I can relate to like not feeling like my body is my own sometimes. Tell me if that's just me. Maybe I've exposed myself. In the final stage, the chronic stage, a patient falls entirely into their delusion and chronic depression. They truly believe they have died and nothing can convince them otherwise. And from here, it's pretty hard to get them back, but not impossible. In fact, in more cases than not nowadays, the patients do tend to go on to live full lives if they survive it, if they don't genuinely take their own lives. I found a New Scientist article from 2013 in which a man called Graham shares his story. One day, 9 years before, Graham woke up and made a startling discovery. He was dead. He'd been suffering with severe depression for a really long time and he tried to end his own life by electrocuting himself in the bath. However, he survived. But 8 months later, he was talking to his doctor, trying to explain to him that his brain had died, or at least it was missing. It no longer existed to him. Doctors repeatedly tried to rationalise with Graham that he must have a brain, that he's sitting there breathing, talking to them. But he couldn't accept it. He said to New Scientist, "I just got annoyed. I didn't know how I could speak or do anything with no brain, but as far as I was concerned, I hadn't got one." He said he felt like he was in this limbo between life and death. Graham had to have carers to ensure he was doing the basic things like eating, washing, socialising. His teeth turned black because he no longer cared to brush them, and this just kind of added to the delusion. Even the things that used to bring him joy, like his car, just became nothing. And before Cotard's, he was also a smoker, and afterwards he no longer got that nicotine hit. The addiction no longer had a hold, which is something I found particularly fascinating because you would think that something like addiction might survive Cotard's, but it wouldn't. He was no longer a smoker. Graham also said that he lost his sense of taste and smell entirely, which is a clue this wasn't just a psychological thing. Something about his brain had changed. The neurons that should have been firing just weren't. Weirdly, he even said all of his leg hair fell out, which is just a really absurd side effect. Remember how Madam X didn't react to pain? This clearly does affect the physical body in some form. And of course, all of this was kind of out of the repertoire of your regular doctor, so Graham got put in touch with expert neurologists Adam Zeman at the University of Exeter here in the UK and Stephen Lawrence at the University of Liege in Belgium, and they did a whole load of scans to figure out what was actually going on in Graham's brain. They actually did the first ever PET scan of a Cotard's brain on Graham, and what they found in that was wild. They found that metabolic activity across large areas of the frontal and parietal brain regions was so low that it resembled somebody that was in a vegetative state. Graham's brain was quite literally not working. He shouldn't have been functioning, but he was. Or maybe in a way he wasn't. Graham's brain function resembled somebody who was in a deep sleep or under anaesthesia, and to see it in somebody who was actually awake was just unheard of. His brain, for all intents and purposes, was dead. We can't draw conclusions about Cotard's as a whole from one single brain scan. All we can do is draw conclusions about Graham's specific case. Could it maybe have been that Graham's brain was like this as a side effect of the electrocution? And there aren't enough Cotard's cases in the world to make sweeping statements, but I would certainly suggest that maybe something similar happened in a lot of the brains, because it does make sense. Their brains are genuinely dead, they're just not working as they should. As I've already mentioned, if people with Cotard's don't succeed in taking their own life, and like I said, many of them do try and take their own lives, they can make recoveries, and Graham did, with plenty of psychotherapy and treatment with drugs. He said he doesn't feel back to normal, but he feels better. He no longer feels brain dead, and now he's not afraid of death because he knows what it feels like. The largest study on Cotard's I could find online seemed to be done in 1995 with an analysis of 100 cases by G.E. Berrios and R. Luke. They found that in terms of clinical profile, there was no difference between men or women, like one wasn't more likely to get it. There were no underlying diagnostic categories. However, age did seem to increase the likelihood of developing the syndrome. Like I said, most people seem to get it in their early 50s. Depression was reported in 89% of subjects, anxiety in 65%, and guilt in 63%. And the latter is super interesting to me. As somebody who suffers with feelings of guilt, like not over anything in particular, but I kind of spend my entire life feeling this intense sense of guilt over anything and everything, I've never really seen it used alongside like anxiety and depression like this. I just thought that was really interesting. It is like a really, really strong emotion that does kind of take over your brain, so it makes sense. The study also distinguished 3 factors leading to the syndrome. So they had psychotic depression, Cotard's type 1, and Cotard's type 2. So under psychotic depression, you're looking at patients who also experience maybe melancholia and a few nihilistic delusions. Cotard's type 1 patients show no past depression or other diseases. It's thought to be a very pure type of Cotard's, pure delusion unaffected by other things going on in the brain. And then type 2 showed anxiety, depression, and auditory hallucination, so a mixture kind of the previous 2. Most people with Cotard's will generally fall under one of these categories. But again, this was a study of only 100 people, which is crazy small for a medical study. But it's also half of the people suffering from it on Earth, so you've got to weigh that up. Researching this has very much unlocked a new fear of mine, like the fear of one day waking up and being dead like a walking corpse, as somebody who does suffer like quite severely with their mental health. The thought of this genuinely being something that I can wake up with one day, I'm officially terrified. A lot of cases do seem to be preempted by something, an electrocution, collapsing, a brain injury. Many sufferers already had some sort of mental health issue, so depression, bipolar, psychosis, schizophrenia. But for some people, there was nothing. They just wake up one morning and they're dead. Cotard's type 1, just pure Cotard's. And these people can't be convinced otherwise. I would be fascinated to hear from any of you if you or anyone you know has ever been affected by Cotard's. Seeing as there's so few sufferers out there in the world, I doubt it, but you never know, crazier things have happened. Tell me your personal stories. Thank you so much to Midas Merge for sponsoring this video. If you would like to check them out, and I highly recommend you do, you can use the QR code that's on screen right now, or you can use the link in the top line of the description. Like I said at the beginning, sponsors are so helpful for me keeping this channel going, so your support, it really does mean a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.